Good morning to everybody. Session Chair, Mr. Akam Steiner, Executive Director of UNEP, Your Excellency, Madam Ayun Sanju Suryan, President of the UN Environment Assembly, Secretary General of UNCTAD, and other panelists that are out here. Excellencies, once again, it's really an honor to be with you all. And warm welcome to all of you to UN ESCAP. The leadership and partnership of ministers from across the region and UN agencies will hopefully enrich our further deliberations that we are going to have in the course of this and next week. As mandated by both the United Nations General Assembly and by the Secretary General himself, ESCAP has, among others, held several consultations as a lead-up to the negotiation and adoption of the Sustainable Development Agenda. I will just reflect on Sustainable Development Consultation, Financing for Development, and follow-up and review mechanism for development implementation, providing you a background for your more specific consultation on the question of environment. First of all, I'd like to, my key message would be that Sustainable Development Agenda is people-centered and planet-sensitive. So it's not about environment ministries, it's about social ministries and economic ministries and environment ministries, looking at each other and working together and not in silos. Second important message that I'd like to make, given from my finance background, is that I believe finance will drive the action and results. And third point that I'd like to make is really regarding the agenda being very nationally driven at the end of the day, starting globally in debates, but it will be the national priorities, be it the sustainable development priorities or the financing priorities. And of course, this will all work if we have proper review and monitoring tools and an appropriate agreement on the follow-up mechanism in Asia Pacific that at least I coordinate. Global negotiations and regional consultations on the post-2015 agenda with sustainability at its core are very advanced today. Of course, there remain differences between the developed and the developing countries, as one would have expected. But we are hoping that these tensions or tenuous debates will be resolved as we go, draw closer to the final conclusion and adoption. The United Nations will host a summit in September to agree on the elements of post-2015 development agenda, specifically adopting a set of universal SDGs. The 17 proposed SDGs are aspirational, comprehensive, and holistic. What drives it is the big slogan, leave no one behind. Most of the proposed goals are therefore people-centered, aimed, for example, 1, end poverty in all its forms, and promote healthy lives and well-being for all, end hunger for all, and ensure availability and sustainable management of energy, water, etc., for all. These features of SDGs are accompanied by proposals to reduce inequalities within countries by uplifting the income of bottom 40% of the population, along with promotion of equality of opportunity and recognition of importance of special and preferential treatment for least developed countries and other countries with special needs. The SDGs also represent a planet-sensitive agenda. The proposed goals address the need for urgent action to combat climate change and its impact, to conserve and responsibly use oceans and marine resources for sustainable development, to protect ecosystems, combat desertification, land degradation, and biodiversity loss. A lot was covered by Akhtar in his keynote, so no need to go further into details of that. But bottom line, I repeat, it's a combination of people-centered and planet-sensitive agenda. This agenda recognizes that we cannot achieve sustainable development without giving due consideration to the priorities of these two P's, people and planet. Implementing this agenda will, of course, call for transformational changes to development strategies and plans which need to balance and integrate social, economic, and environmental consideration. Now, I have been a member of the cabinet at one time, and I can tell you the central bank used to sit in one place and the environment ministers used to sit at the other end. That needs to change. And economic ministries dialogue used to happen in the ECC, we used to call Economic Coordination Committee, and environment guys and girls used to be separate. That has to change. That's what this agenda is about. So, hence, it's important to recognize that the integration of the three dimensions of sustainability, which has been agreed a long time back, perhaps before some of us were born, but debates continue about what balanced integration should entail, how best to achieve it in light of difficult trade-offs and binding resource constraints. To address this gap, ESCAP is going to launch and will release a new theme study, as I pointed out earlier, during the Asia-Pacific Sustainable Development Forum later this week, which, along with the background paper of the session 2 that UNAP has floated, which is a very impressive compilation of how the integration works in terms of the evidence and the correlation that it has been able to capture, that comes from phenomenal literature survey that I need to compliment the team, lays together a conceptual framework for why and how to integrate the three dimensions of sustainable development. Our work underscores that the foundation of a framework for sustainable development must be region-wide acceptance of social justice and ecological sustainability as fundamental policy objectives. It further advocates environmental protection and the sustainable use of natural resources must be informed by best available science, as Akhtar pointed out earlier with concrete examples, implemented, of course, by right technologies, again illustrated by Akhtar very well, and must fully engage all stakeholders. A shared understanding of sustainable development, social consensus, and a new social contract must be forged. Social contract has often been a very neglected element of the development literature, and it is, of course, assuming a new dimension, of course, after the Arab Revolution that occurred, and it so happened that I was heading the Middle East and North Africa hub of the World Bank, and we obviously started doing extensive literature on social contract. And I must confess that it is fascinating, and it will pay very high dividends if we really worked into this, develop the social contract. And hopefully we will launch work at ESCAP to develop an understanding of how social contract will reinforce the other dimensions. Let me now turn to what I said earlier, that finance will drive action and results. The successful implementation of SDG everywhere in the UN corridors, it's written up, hinges on sourcing adequate and alternative financing for development. In a recent joint session of post-2015 and FFD consultation, there has been broad recognition of the merits of ensuring that two tracks, the Sustainable development and financing for development are synergistic, complementary, and will make sustainable development possible. In this context, of course, there have been calls for outcomes of the 3rd International Conference on Financing for Development, which is to be held in Addis Ababa in July, to match the level of aspiration of the proposed SDGs and their associated targets. And I have to confess, getting the finance ministers to sit with the environment ministers is not a small job. But at least we were able to bring finance ministers to our regional platform on 29th and 30th of April, including the central bank governors and financing experts from private sector, the fund managers and all, to talk about financing for development for our region. And I'm very pleased because I have today received a report, very brief report, about the latest draft of FFD consultations that are taking place in New York. And I can see that they are listening to our region in particular. Because and I am going to very quickly talk about the major highlights of it because they are just off the press now, that one, like our region said, they should cover the full remit of financing for development agenda, which is my point about all sources. Second, there is a chapter there on science, technology, innovation, and capacity building. There was a big debate that financing, excessive emphasis just on financing for development could lead to a neglect of science, technology, and innovation. As we know, this is all intricately interrelated. Second point that it makes what I have said, that it will respect the priorities of national sustainable development strategies. And in an earlier few drafts that we had, there were global targets being laid out for domestic resource mobilization and other things. That is now being replaced by asking the governments to come up with national revenue targets. 4 cross-cutting investment areas, basically that underscoring concrete initiatives on social protection and essential services, nutrition, rural development, agriculture, fisheries, sustainable and resilient infrastructure innovation, and SME financing will feature quite effectively. What is new to all of us, I'm sure, that there was a push to get more funding for LDCs at the end of the day from official development assistance, and you all know the story on ODA. But they were earlier talking about 15 to 20% of the flows of ODA to go to LDCs, and I believe now the debates are hot that half of the ODA flows should go to LDCs. I think this is great news. From where I come, I have represented in my future career multilateral development banking business, and I can't tell you how significant this would be if this were to happen. Now, so that's kind of a very quick snapshot of what is just coming off from the 7th May document, which we have just received information on now. Now, with regard to mainstreaming environmental priorities in the FFD framework, outcome document offers several opportunities too, and I will just talk about few of them. Fund mobilization and appropriate modalities for climate finance, one of the most important deliverables of the SDGs. These are, of course, being discussed in both UNFCCC processes, but also being reinforced in the financing for development track. Climate change, one of the greatest global threats, will push, of course, millions of people in developing countries back into poverty, and lack of supportive finance will pose a major challenge to achievement of the SDGs. So hence, my emphasis on countries with special needs, which is going to take a very significant amount of our time in our commission deliberation as well as other consultation. Second point, proper pricing of carbon and energy use, as well as removal of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. A good window now with oil prices decline. And of course, making a strong case for natural capital accounting for greater transparency of the environmental externalities of policy decisions. Savings from fuel subsidies not only offer fiscal scope for social protection and related areas, but also generate opportunities for carbon neutral investments as you impose levies on the use of technologies or fuel that is more dangerous for emissions. The third point for environmental stuff is really you need the incentives for low carbon alternatives to promote investment in energy infrastructure and clean energy technology. Final, greater mobilization of financial resources to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity and ecosystem. The availability of clean technology is a key element for the successful implementation of the SDGs. And as Akhtar pointed out, the cost will come down provided the initial investments are made, because it's really the supply that will drive the prices down. But before supply gets in place, you really need to generate demand. The transfer of clean and environmentally sound technologies has been identified as a priority area to support the protection of environment and to promote sustainability, for example, in low carbon technologies, air pollution, and environmental monitoring and assessment systems. So let me move now to the national priorities for sustainable development. To make this transformational agenda happen, we do know from what I have just talked about that the FFD attempts to respect the national priorities element. The governments, of course, should not lose sight of the poverty eradication imperative and the emphasis being placed on how to anchor the post-2015 development agenda in human rights-based approach. Two, recognize that SDGs will need to be met globally but implemented locally, and that this calls for institutionalizing an effective national prioritization process with supportive regional backing, keeping in view difficult policy trade-offs within financing constraints. Third, consider adopting inclusive and green or blue growth strategies as may be applicable, which offer effective approaches and policy instruments to integrate these three dimensions for balanced and sustainable growth. Fourth, mainstreaming inclusivity in development plans and fiscal frameworks to examine options for financing sustainable development, either through reorientation of public expenditures, more effective domestic resource mobilization efforts, or by leveraging private and international public finances. Fifth, developing better understanding of core set of sustainable technologies, systems, and actors. For example, applications such as emission trading systems, fair trade networks, microfinance and financial inclusion solutions, resource substitution programs, and technological innovations in key areas such as recycling and energy efficiency. Six, draw on transition arrangement approaches to shape thinking, policies, and instruments to leverage work on transitional dynamics and change both mindsets and behaviors. Nationally driven, coherent, and fully integrated conceptual frameworks with the proper prioritization of development paths and financing arrangements are critical for sustainability in our region. To support this work, ESCAP, given its intergovernmental mandate, will continue to deliberate on issues and priorities for Asia-Pacific SDG implementation with our partners, in particular UNAP. This will, among others, feed into the high-level political forum on sustainable development. And as we are speaking, there is a text that is being fine-tuned to give a role to regional commissions to coordinate the regional dimension. In consultation with ESCAP, our committee on statistics has launched a lot of work to build national capacities for data and statistics, including, of course, environmental accounting. In partnership with the UN partners, ESCAP will be coordinating a regional monitoring and accountability framework backed by support to better statistical development capacities. To conclude, there will be a regional follow-up and review for sustainable development. In recent rounds of intergovernmental consultation, much needed discussion took place on the role and responsibilities of regional commissions in the development agenda beyond 2015. ESCAP, of course, will follow the instructions and intensify collaboration with UN agencies, in particular UNEP, as I said, to support the fostering of synergies between economic, social, and environmental priorities, strengthening governance of long-term policy, and entrenching institutional frameworks for sustainability in diverse functional areas. For follow-up and review mechanism, member states have already recognized that the regional commissions must play a central role in regional follow-up and review processes in a consultation we held last year. This, of course, will anchor on trying to develop sharing information, knowledge and experience, as well as strengthening capacities and defining coherent regional policies and approaches to transboundary challenges which become very important in case of environment. Regional support can also help countries translate global goals into policies, guidelines, recommendations, and standards for national implementation and to mobilize partnerships for South-South collaboration. So, your guidance on issues of environmental sustainability, climate action, green and blue economy will be especially valuable as we work to advance our mandate in this area. Our shared challenge, however, is to recognize that transformation for sustainable development requires to advocate beyond traditional functional areas, to collaborate across sectors, and to act in concert to implement all of the SDGs to be agreed in September. I'm not doing a marketing job here, but I think regional commissions were set up precisely to cross-fertilize the cross-sectoral dimensions, using, of course, the strengths of UN agencies. So we are called upon now to initiate and implement normative shifts from a predominantly short-term horizon, policy horizon, to one that seeks long-term benefits for all, with equivalent shifts and strengthening of institutional frameworks and their coordination functions, and to lead sustainable development with balanced integration of the three dimensions. So thank you for being patient with my delivery. Everything that I said is because UNEP asked me to cover this area. So if you thought it was excessive, they had to be plain. Thank you, Akam, for this partnership.